These massive blocks of marble, huge, very, very beautiful temple. And yet he says, "Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." And all this happened, as you know, in AD 70. Titus lit the thing on fire and everything collapsed. Sort of like 9/11, the same type of thing. Everything just collapsed. The heat was so intense. And they just dumped everything into the Kidron Valley afterwards. The disciples in verse 3 want to know, when is this going to happen? We read, "Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be?'" And he does tell them that this is pretty soon, actually. He says, dropping down to verse 33, "So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors." He's referring, you remember from last week, to verse 15. When you see the abomination of desolation there in the temple, you can know that this is coming quickly. Furthermore, you note verse 34, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So this is coming down the road fairly soon. But it's different with the second coming. You note the shift here in the biblical text. He has said in verse 33, "When you see all these things, know that it is near." Now you come to verse 36, and please note the shift. It is obvious. "But of that day and hour," and he's speaking about his second coming, "no one knows." It's amazing how many men have tried to predict the second coming, and they're always wrong. And they look pretty foolish, don't they? He says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven." There are angels who exist, powerful, intellectual beings who are there in the very presence of God. You and I are not there yet. We're on earth. There are angels in heaven, lots of them, very close to God, and they don't know. You and I don't know. "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." We must not play that game of trying to predict the year, the month, the day, the hour. We're going to look pretty silly. But we now move to 1b. He does tell us what history is going to look like. Notice how he lays this out beginning in verse 37 of Matthew 24. "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." And notice he says some things about the days of Noah. We already read some material about the days of Noah. "For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage," that is, living life totally on the horizontal level, total secularism. There's nothing wrong with these things in themselves, but for them, that's all that life was. It is just eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage, and that is life. Eat, drink, be merry. Tomorrow we die. And you notice what he says, they kept on doing that right up to the last moment. Jesus says, You notice Jesus accepts the total historicity of the Genesis account. This is God, Messiah, Son of Man, Son of God, speaking. We stand with him. Until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. They did not understand. We're not committed to the things of God at all. No understanding until the very last minute, and then they understood. He says, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, how's it going to go? People are going to be engaged in regular economic activity. He says in verse 40, and he gives some examples in terms of the ancient world, first century, then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken. And remember, that links with verse 31, when the angels of God at the second coming come and take the elect. One will be taken and the other left. He will face the wrath of God. What about women? 2 women will be grinding at the mill in terms of that culture, that society. That is what women did at that time. One will be taken, the elect. The other left. Now, you have there in your bulletin an insert which tries to lay out, and the biblical texts are there. One simply has to go find the biblical texts. And you'll note there in that small piece of paper at the top, it's Matthew 24:37a, as the days of Noah were. And Jesus says some things about the days of Noah, but so also does Genesis, and so also does the Apostle Peter. And then in the bottom half, Matthew 24:37b, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. And there are, Jesus says, going to be lines of continuity and parallels between these 2 time periods in history. Now you'll note here, I have 6 points under the first part and 6 points under the second. And you just pull the biblical data together, and you can see the kind of thing that Jesus is talking about first. So let's go through this. What can we expect about history right before Jesus comes back? Now, this is our Lord Jesus Christ who is speaking. He knows what's going to happen. Number 1 at the top, you have total depravity. And we read that passage earlier. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The problem with man, Moses writes this under divine inspiration, is the heart. What we are deep down inside. And it was only evil continually. Then you'll note, number 1 at the bottom, Paul says, but know this, that in the last days perilous times will come, and he explains the total depravity of the last days in a long list of sins. And there it is, you can see it. It's 2 Timothy 3:1-5. Total depravity unleashed again. Number 2 at the top. You notice what Peter has to say. 2 Peter 2:5, God did not spare the ancient world, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. The word Peter uses, asabes, ungodly, means that they were irreverent, they were godless, they were people who lived their life at that time without reverence, without awe toward God, lived only on the horizontal level. They were pure secularists. That's what Jesus says, and I have there Matthew 24:38. The life lived on this horizontal plane. They were ungodly. What about before Jesus comes back? Notice number 2. Jesus says this, Luke 18:8. When the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? There's not going to be much faith on the earth There will be faith, but not a whole lot in comparison. He's going to have a hard time, as it were, finding faith on the earth when he comes back. That is Jesus speaking. Note number 3, violence at the top. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. The word kamas means violence, wrong, or cruelty. And you'll note there the violence under number 3, Romans 1:28-31, mentions that they will be full of murder. But if you go back to number 1, under total depravity, you have the word brutal. The last days, men are going to be brutal. The word there means that they are going to be untamed. They're not going to be gentle. They're going to be savage. They're going to be vicious. We see that, don't we? Number 4 at the top. This is amazing. You have the world the way it was, and yet there was true preaching. We've got to remember this about Noah. 2 Peter 2:5, God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness. Noah was God's messenger, kerux, an ambassador for God. He preached righteousness. He taught the difference between right and wrong, what God expects in our conduct, and what the moral order is. Noah laid it out for that generation in his preaching. That's what Peter says. He was a herald of righteousness. Notice number 4 at the bottom. Jesus asserts and assumes that there is going to be preaching right up to the end. He says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Preaching right up to the end. There will be true preaching, some. But how are people going to respond? Look at number 5 at the top. That generation was without understanding. They heard Noah, but they did so without understanding. Jesus says in Matthew 24:39, they did not know. They heard him with their ears, but they didn't have a clue what he was talking about. They did not know until the flood came and took them all away. Then finally they woke up, but it was too late. And you'll note here, number 5, down at the bottom, Paul talks about what's going to happen right before the end, 2 Timothy 4:3. The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers. Now, what's going to happen in the liberal churches, the apostate churches? You want to know what's going to happen? Paul lays it out here. Look at what he says. They will turn their ears away from the truth. The word aletheia, truth, reality, facts, what has certainty and validity. We don't want to hear certainty, validity, facts. We prefer make-believe stuff. They will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fable. Fables, the word is muthos. Myths, legends, fiction, the imaginative, the bizarre, intellectual wackiness. They will prefer intellectual wackiness and the bizarre to the truth. That is exactly what he says, first century. They will prefer the weird to the true. That's what's going to happen. Number 6 at the top. There's going to be a remnant, though. There was a remnant back in the ancient world. 2 Peter 2:5. God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people. Only 8 people were spared. We don't know the number when Christ comes back. Nobody knows. God knows. We just know, number 6 down at the bottom, what Jesus says. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. And the angels will gather together God's elect, Jesus says, Matthew 24:31. The number, we have no clue. This is what Jesus Christ asserts. This is how it is going to go. This is how the ride is going to go. Now, it's very interesting that Jesus, after he lays this out, starts to talk about how we should live. And so let's look at this, and this starts in Matthew 24, and let's just make some comments, and then we'll come to a close. We're in Matthew 24, verse 42. Jesus says, watch. The word there means, it can't be translated just to stay awake. And of course, it's not the physical, but spiritually, make sure you're awake. Watch, therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. And then he talks about a situation where the master of a house is aware. For example, if you knew that a thief was going to break into your house at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning, I guarantee you the break-in would not happen. It would not happen. He'd be stopped at the door. That's what he's saying. He says in verse 43, but know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. It's not going to happen. Because he's ready. And there's going to be another break-in. It's a cosmic break-in. And Jesus says, you'll note in verse 44, therefore you also be ready. For the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. You need to be ready. You need to put your trust, he says, in me. You need to turn from your sin. Call upon me to be your Savior. Bow the knee to me as your Lord. And that's how you get ready. It's actually pretty easy. And it can happen in 5 seconds. It is a turning to him. And you can be ready. But then he continues. And now we come down to verse 45. And here you have the account of a master who goes away and he gives responsibility to his servant. And Jesus asks us basically, he asks everyone, are you going to give your life to God as a servant? Are you going to carry out the responsibilities that God has entrusted to you? He asks a question to everyone. Here he is, verse 45. Who then is a faithful and wise servant? The question goes out to the world. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Are you going to be, when all is said and done with your life, a faithful and wise servant? It's either yes or no. Which is it? That's what he says to you and me. And if you are a faithful and wise servant, it's going to go well. He says in verse 46, blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Blessedness to you, Jesus says. Surely I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. You'll have greater responsibilities, privileges, and honor in the world to come. You're blessed. You just have to be faithful. That's all God wants out of you and me. Be faithful to what God has given you to do. Now, then he shifts, you'll note in verse 48. And there are people who say, I am not accountable to God. There are people who say, I will live as I please. We hear this out of people. It's my life and it's my body. No one is going to tell me how to live. Not even God. Jesus addresses that person. You note in verse 48, he says, but if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards. Notice this man, first of all. He's totally self-centered. This is what he's all about. He wants to eat and drink with the drunkards. That's the glory of life to this man. Eat and drink with the drunkards, and furthermore, be abusive in human relationships. He's beating his fellow servants. He doesn't think that the master's coming back. He's not accountable. He'll live as he pleases. Now, Jesus addresses those people in the world who have that thinking and have lived that way. And he's got some news. And it's shocking, actually, what he says. People, I think, would be surprised to know what Jesus actually teaches if they would actually open the Gospels and read them from time to time. This is a shocking statement. But listen, this is who Jesus Christ is. This is reality. Verse 50. The master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of. Now, this is the shocking thing. Wait, imagine. You mean to tell me Jesus speaks this way? This is Jesus. This is who he is. Verse 51, and will cut him in two. And appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. Now that's an interesting statement, because this man is a hypocrite in this account. Because you'll note in verse 48, he calls him my master. It's just empty words. He's a hypocrite. And Jesus says that hypocrites will spend eternity with hypocrites. It's very interesting. Dante wrote the Inferno. Maybe some of you have read it. I wonder if Dante was thinking about this text. Because Dante says that murderers will spend eternity in a compartment of hell filled with murderers. Liars spend eternity with liars in a special compartment in hell. Interesting thought. Those who have anger and hatred go to that compartment in hell. You live like that, you're going to spend eternity with people like that. Jesus seems to be pointing, in some sense, in that direction at least. The man's a hypocrite. He gets his portion with the hypocrites. And you notice he is speaking about hell. He says there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So Jesus here drives this home with some very intense application, the doctrine of last things, and then it really goes after ethics heavily in the Olivet Discourse. Now I want to end with a selection from John Calvin. If you take that out, it says there are two sides. The one side is says number 6. That's where we want to start. And I want to read some selective statements. This is beautiful, one of the most wonderful things I've ever seen. Because Jesus is saying to us, again in verse 45, he says, who then is a faithful and wise servant? And Calvin, in the Institutes, talks about the fact that you and I have been given a calling by God. It's different for every one of us. It's not the same. And let's just read some selective statements here, and this is where you'll see the number 6 on the one side there, and some selective statements, and you can ponder this. I find this a very powerful, very moving explanation of the doctrine of God's call. He says the last thing to be observed is that the Lord enjoins every one of us in all the actions of life to have respect to our own calling. And you drop down to the 5th line, middle of the line, he says he has assigned distinct duties to each in the different modes of life, and that no one may presume to overstep his proper limits. He has distinguished the different modes of life by the name of callings. Every man's mode of life, therefore, is a kind of station assigned him by the Lord, that he may not be always driven about at random. That's a fascinating thing, that God has given you, beloved, and me, he has given us a station, a post, a work. It is different for all of us. If you drop down to the second last line on that side of the page, middle of the line, he says, it is enough to know that in everything the call of God is the foundation and beginning of right action. Amazing. You can see how important this is. This is the beginning of proper ethics. You and I know what we're supposed to do, and we do it. And if you flip that over to the other side, and this is on that other side, it's line 6. He says he will not attempt more than his calling justifies, knowing that it is unlawful to overleap the prescribed bounds. He who is obscure will not decline to cultivate a private life, that he may not desert the post at which God has placed him. Now, think about this. Think about your call. Think about my call. Every call has painful things involved. Difficulties. Your things are difficult. My things are difficult. It is true of all of us. A father, mother, student, whoever it is. Unique difficulties in our calls. Calvin relates to that. He says, again, in all our cares, toils, annoyances, and other burdens, it will be no small alleviation to know that all these are under the superintendence of God. Isn't that amazing? God knows. God knows. You know, I know it's a real pain, okay, what you're going through. God knows. It's an annoyance. It's a nuisance. It's hard. God knows. That's what he's saying. The magistrate will more willingly perform his office, and the father of a family confine himself to his proper sphere. Everyone in his particular mode of life will, without repining, suffer its inconveniences, cares, uneasiness, and anxiety, persuaded that God has laid on the burden. Wow. The burden you have, God laid it on you. This too will afford admirable consolation, that in following your proper calling no work will be so mean and sordid as not to have a splendor and value in the eye of God.